Hello, Cornerstone family. Carlos Price here again. Hope you're having a Christ-centered day full of grace. As Pastor Carlos mentioned in his devotion on Wednesday, this week our focus will be on God's grace. We will see God's grace in and through the life of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10, which says, "But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me did not prove vain. But I labored even more than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God with me." Notice that the word grace is mentioned 3 times in this verse. God is saying that relying on his enabling grace is the key for you as you live your Christian life. So first, let's see that God's grace transformed Paul's life. We see God's grace in Paul's life first in verse 9, where he says that he didn't deserve to be called an apostle, and even said that he was the least of the apostles. Then in verse 10, Paul says, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am." Paul provided a striking contrast about his life as a believer compared to his pre-conversion lifestyle when he had persecuted the church. Remember in Acts chapter 7, Paul had Stephen stoned. Can you imagine that? But God's amazing grace changed Paul's life after God graciously saved him on the road to Damascus and called him to minister as an apostle to the Gentiles, as we see in Acts chapter 9. Well, what exactly is the grace of God? What does that mean? Grace is from the Greek word charis and is a communicable attribute of God that works as a powerful influence in our lives. Normally, we define grace by using the acronym GRACE, which stands for God's riches at Christ's expense. Exactly. Systematic theology author Wayne Grudem says, "The entire living of the Christian life can be seen to result from God's continuous bestowal of grace." Cleon Rogers Jr. and Cleon Rogers III adds to that and says that grace is the help or favor granted to one who is undeserving with no thought of any return. God gave believers a gift of grace, salvation, and faith to secure our redemption, as you know, and it says it in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. So the source of grace is God, and God freely gives it to us, and we should be gracious to others also, right? Did you know that God's abundant grace in Paul's life and in your life is never without purpose? Next, we'll see that God's grace worked in Paul's life. His grace worked in his life. Verse 10 says, "And his grace toward me did not prove vain." God's grace in Paul's life was not worthless, but accomplished exactly what God desired. In fact, Philippians chapter 2, verse 13 says, "For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." The grace of God is working in your life and is producing discipline, training, learning, spiritual transformation, and in the end, to be glorified like Christ, as 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18 says. So how did Paul give 100% in his ministry? Well, lastly, we'll see that God's grace strengthened Paul. God's grace strengthened him in ministry. Paul says, "But I labored even more than all of them." By God's grace, Paul lived longer and had a more extensive ministry than most of the other 11 apostles. God's grace allowed him to preach and minister for Christ to the point of weariness and exhaustion. John MacArthur says, "Labor does not stress the amount of work, but rather the effort. A man's reward from God is proportional to the excellence of his ministry and the effort he puts into it." MacArthur says, "Excellence combined with diligence mark a man worthy of the highest honor." Wow, what a statement. Well, Paul finishes verse 10 and says, "Yet not I, but the grace of God with me." Paul did not take credit for his strength to labor for Christ. Paul knew that when it was all said and done, it was God's grace that allowed him to become an apostle and to serve mightily for Jesus Christ. If God's grace can transform Paul, who was an enemy of God, into a faithful apostle who did mighty things for God, think again how God's amazing grace is transforming and strengthening your life through his word today. Amen? Well, thanks for listening. And if you have any prayer requests, please send them to prayer@cornerstonebible.org. Have a great day.